Hello and welcome back to Reimagine version 14, our university edition. If this is your first time joining us, welcome in. And if not, welcome back. And thanks for tuning back in. We've interviewed over 600 projects, teams, and thought leaders in the blockchain crypto space. And the goal of our virtual conference is to educate and inform everybody, including those new to the crypto space, longtime holders, and industry professionals. So make sure you subscribe below to keep staying informed and enjoy what we have in store for you today. And today we are super excited to bring back a regular and fan favorite at our events, Mr. Paul Brody, global blockchain leader at Ernst & Young. He's been a part of many of Reimagine's virtual events, including our Coins docu-series. So if you're looking for more of Mr. Brody and you haven't seen that yet, it's available for free on our YouTube channel. Welcome back, Paul. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to return back with us for another great discussion. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thank you guys for having me.
And like I mentioned before, this is our university edition. Our focus in this edition was to invite student blockchain partners to come and ask questions and discuss groundbreaking new technologies with some of the most influential thought and business leaders in the industry. So in that vein, our company MouseBelt has been working with more than 80 student blockchain organizations from universities spanning multiple continents, providing support in a variety of ways, from internships, office hours, sponsorships, as well as early stage projects investment. So today I have joining us for our discussion alongside our other special guests, Kimlong, representing the University of Washington. Happy for you to join us today. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing too?
Pretty good. Please, yeah, before we move on with the interview, could you tell us a little bit about your club, maybe how many members there are, the majors, if you know any of the distribution, and maybe some activities and projects that y'all have planned for the year?
All right. So at the University of Washington, we are actually, our club is a University Blockchain Society, and we are comprised of all three campuses. We have UW Seattle, and then UW Bothell, and then UW Tacoma. And in total, we have around 600 members in the club. And these club, 600 members, and around 50% of the members are CS students or any technical related development students. And the rest are either business or humanities. So I would say like 30% business and the rest are other humanities, etc. So what are some of the backgrounds of our members? So we have each campus has their own vice president and president. I am the Department of Education for the club, and then let's go on to activities. So what do our clubs get into? So our club hosts hackathons, and then we also host speaker events and talks, and then events on how people get educated on blockchain in general. And then we also, upcoming month actually, we're creating a thing called a case hack, where we're going to combine the elements of a case competition and a hackathon. And then this is to target like the people that are not technical, and also like in addition to the technical people, and pairing them up to solve a real world problem. And then we also we're planning to host conferences or UW Blockchain Expo this spring, which is exciting. And what excites me about blockchain technology, well, the thing right now, most thing excited about is scalability solutions and certain like ZK rollups and ZK proofs and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, definitely a big gap there between the technical and non-technical. It definitely needs to get filled. Also with us today are Jeremy and Issy from Northeastern. Happy for you both to join us today. Please, if you could y'all also tell us a little bit about your club and the distribution of the majors, activities y'all have planned for the year, things like that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for having us on. My name's Jeremy, currently the president of the Northeastern Blockchain Club. I'm joined by Izzy, our director of governance. So a little bit about the club. So we've been around for a little over a year now. We just hit a couple cool milestones as a club. So we reached over 1,000 students on our mailing list, over 1,000 Instagram followers, just over like 550 Twitter followers, and around 700 in our Discord. So we're definitely trying to grow the club as much as we can on Northeastern's campus. So they kind of talk about activities and kind of split of students. So as a club, we have 6 main initiatives. First being our weekly speaker events. So this is where we bring in industry leaders, mostly in person, to speaker events to kind of talk with the students and teach stuff like that. And then we also have a research team, tech team, governance team, podcast, and then a new initiative this semester is Women in Blockchain. So our research teams kind of split into 2 tracks, our Discover and Alpha. Our Discover track is meant for people new to the space to bring them up to 0 to 100 knowledge base. And then our Alpha track works with different sponsors in the space, such as Coinmetrics, who we co-authored a paper with last semester. And then our governance team, Izzy can definitely talk more on later. That's her domain. And then our tech team, we're mainly sending students out to hackathons and kind of teaching them the skills necessary to compete well. Last weekend, actually at Hack Boston, we were able to send, I think, around 25 plus students, and we won multiple first place kind of prizes in different tracks. So definitely a big growth coming in there. And then podcasts similar to speaker events, just on a digital forum. And then our Women in Blockchain initiative is super awesome. Kicking off this semester, kind of led by one of our past presidents and alumni, Allison, who now works for Hedera Hashgraph. So yeah, that's a little bit about the club. And then kind of demographics of the club. We're split pretty 50-50 between business and CS kids. So definitely kind of good mix of opinions and stuff like that. And then personally, very excited about GameFi and interoperability within the blockchain space. Izzy, on to you.
Sure. So like Jeremy said, I am one of the directors of governance at NEU Blockchain. So what we do on the governance team is we strive to get token delegations from various entities that we can then use to participate in various DeFi protocols. Last semester, we were engaged with TribeDAO, and then this semester, we are looking to onboard 2 more projects. Yeah, our governance team has certainly grown since last semester, and it's really cool to see, an interest really picking up in the space. And even from myself personally, governance is definitely an area of the crypto world that I've become very fond of. And I think it provides a great opportunity to really contribute something meaningful to the projects that you love.
Definitely. With the popularity of proof of stake, governance is definitely going to be a large part of the ecosystem moving forward, I would think. So let's go ahead and move on to the questions. We can start with Northeastern, and then when there's a natural lull, we'll flip to Washington, and then hopefully I'll take a crack at it. But this is a discussion, so don't hesitate to join in just because it's the other party's question or anything like that. So, all right, please go ahead, Jeremy and Izzy.
Sure. So I can kick us off. I think what would be a great intro question for you, Paul, is that you've said that blockchains will do for networks of enterprises what ERP did for the single company. Would you be able to just provide some color on that and explain what are the parallels between those two on their respective scales?
Yeah, absolutely. So many people don't really know what ERP is, but ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. And basically all large companies run on ERP systems. And really, the ERP systems came out of what started in the 1960s as MRP systems, materials requirements planning, and it spread from manufacturing to the whole organization. But the idea is relatively simple, and a lot of it started with manufacturing, which is if I order 1,000 mugs, right? Well, 1,000 mugs require like 1,000 sheets and 1,000 bases and 1,000 lids and 1,000 little things. And when do I plan them and how do I order them and how do I make sure I have enough? And they all have to come together, and then somebody has to put them together. And the idea behind MRP and eventually ERP was, let's start to have some common rules and process and business logic that governs our enterprise. And it spread across the enterprise, and it did a lot of really fundamental things, like let's say you're an enterprise and you have decided that everywhere in the world you're going to use FedEx or DHL as your shipping company. Well, in the past, it was really hard to enforce any kind of enterprise rule. So it's fine if you want to say, everybody, we should use this company. But what happens when the guy in Oklahoma decides he's got a good buddy at the competition and he wants to use them instead? Well, in the past, the answer was nothing at all. But with ERP, we could make it so that when you tried to print out a shipping label, it really would only let you do it for your preferred entity. Oh, and if you wanted to get it for something else, you have to get like a special approval. So essentially what ERP does, it said, we can have common process and shared business data across an enterprise. And we can do that in a really scalable way. And ERP made it possible for large companies to get much, much larger because they could execute much more consistently at scale. It's not an accident that sort of ERP and really, really large enterprises sort of grew hand in hand together. Blockchain makes that possible to extend that across enterprise boundaries. One of the things that you don't realize until you've been involved in ERP implementations and connecting with companies is that all the cool stuff that we figured out how to do over the last 50 years with the MRP and then constraint-based planning and then ERP, all of that stuff disappears the minute two companies try to interact with each other. We're back to like basically emailing you a PDF file that you can scan into your computer. It is that bad. And all these things of like, hey, let's have a shared process, let's have some shared rules, that common data, just goes out the window because I've got my system and you've got yours. With blockchain, we could have a common process that spans 10 different companies, and we could have shared data and shared rules across all of that. And increasingly, over the last like 20 or 30 or 50 years, the biggest challenge for large companies isn't how do I run my own business, it's how do I coordinate my business with everybody else. If you think about cool stuff like new phones, you have to realize like companies that make phones, the big brand names in this business, have almost no factories of their own. In many cases, they have no factories whatsoever of their own. What they do is they coordinate the work of hundreds of other companies. And that is really, really hard, difficult work. It is the most difficult work and probably the most time-consuming work that enterprises do is managing their relationship that they have in the ecosystem. And with blockchain, we have the potential to standardize and simplify that in the same way that we did with ERP inside the enterprise.
I've heard sometimes some people call that triple entry accounting, where that's the evolution of ERP. I think somebody I've heard that just recently.
So triple entry accounting is it's very sort of accounting centric. You know, it implies like I have a purchase item, and double entry means I sort of have balanced both sides of my books, credit and debit. Triple entry means I have both sides of my books, plus I keep like a copy on chain. I don't think triple entry accounting really does this kind of concept justice, because this is about active business process. It's about setting up rules. It's about continuity of data. So I think triple entry accounting, it tends to be a sort of very accounting specific mindset, whereas the extension of ERP into this like shared business space is, I think, much more transformational for enterprises.
I mean, that makes total sense. And thank you for the explanation. And a slight follow-up to that is, so you spoke about shared business data, but am I correct in stating that this doesn't necessarily include the content of enterprise transactions on the public blockchain? So I know that your work at EY has been focused a lot on privacy and security of those transactions, because enterprises don't want that kind of information out in the public, because that's going to be a disadvantage, competitively speaking. But yeah, I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts on that and what kind of technologies you're exploring to guarantee that privacy for your clients, whether it's zero knowledge proofs or...
I spent many, many years in enterprise software, and I kind of knew pretty much immediately, once I really understood how blockchains work, that the big limitation on blockchains was privacy. If you're an enterprise, right, smart contracts sound really cool, but if my competition knows what I'm buying, how much I'm paying, and what the terms are of my deal, I've given away some really, really sensitive business information. So my goal at EY over the last few years is to fix that gap. And there's a couple of different ways to fix that gap. And the easy way is to create like a permissioned blockchain where some central authority can control things. But permissioned blockchains are kind of pointless. What is the point of having a centrally managed decentralized ledger? Frankly speaking, there just isn't one. There is no point to centrally manage decentralized ledgers. It's an oxymoron. And because if 10 companies could agree on a single party to run a network for them, they could have agreed 50 years ago just to have IBM set up a mainframe for them. That, we could have done all of this 50 years ago. There's nothing special about it. And indeed, if it could have been done, it would have been done, right? And the reality is that all these blockchain consortia have largely failed because they fail for the same reasons that they would have done 30, 40, or 50 years ago, which is that get 50 companies together and you'll have 50 different opinions of what's important and how to get it done, and nobody will actually agree upon something. The internet was wildly successful in part because the standards are the standards and you kind of have to manage around them. And that made a huge difference, right? That the constraint and the openness made it much more scalable, and people adapted and they standardized to that. So we have to get to the same way. Once we discarded the idea that private blockchains are a viable solution, we end up with a different set of options, all of which are much, much harder than kind of setting up a private blockchain. And they, starting about 6 years ago, we built up our first R&D team and we said, okay, how are we going to deal with privacy? And after a lot of sort of fumbling around and experiments and discussion, we concluded that zero knowledge proofs were going to be the only way to do it. And we looked at snarks and starks, and eventually we settled on snarks. And I'm not a good enough math person to tell you why, right? But we picked snarks. We picked ZK snarks, and we ultimately realized that there's really two things that have to be done. The first is we need privacy to move tokens around, right? If I have money or assets or widgets and I want to give them to you, I don't want to tell you how many I've given or how many are received for what I gave. So one thing is moving stuff around under privacy. I think we've largely solved that problem with a technology called Nightfall, which is now being, we developed it, we put it into the public domain. It's being picked up and run as Polygon Nightfall, which is a privacy-centric layer 2 network for enterprises. So that's the first piece of it. I can now move stuff around. I can still see some things. I can see what you put into Polygon Nightfall. I can see what you can take out of it, right? And I can see when you transact with the system. And we will require user identification to use it. So the regulators will also be able to see if you're transacting heavily, although we will not know what you're doing. It will be up to the entity to disclose that to regulators. That's good. It's not enough. It does unlock some really important use cases. Like I can do things like move inventory under privacy and know that my competition can't see what I'm doing because I'm just putting in a mathematical proof. But it doesn't fix the other part of the problem, which is if I want to have complex multi-party smart contracts with shared business rules, I can't execute that under Nightfall. So we're working on a second technology called Starlight. And what Starlight does is it allows you to take a pretty standard Solidity smart contract, mark up the parts of it that you want to be kept private, and it will compile it into a zero knowledge circuit, which is basically a giant black box that executes logic in a provably truthful way of the logic that you wanted, but cannot be read or disclosed externally. So we're now in sort of I'll call it the early alpha stage of Starlight. My ultimate goal is to have business logic and private transactions, be able to put them together so that you can run any business-to-business process under privacy on a public blockchain. I know it's not very ambitious, right?
No, it should be very interesting. There's a lot of questions left to be answered there, because my first question in response would be, how is this not what you're talking about, just centralized, decentralized, right? It sounds like there's a layer of that's going on. So just from my layman's perspective.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. One of the things that we've been super careful about doing with, for example, with Polygon Nightfall is making sure that there's no centralization. So you have to disclose your identity, but the way we're going to try to set it up is that you will obtain, say, an SSL certificate or an identity certificate from a third party, right? And that will automatically qualify you to use the system. There will be no centralized human. We will have multiple proposers. Polygon Nightfall will be truly decentralized. Starlight will be probably an open source application that anyone can use. So the logic and the rules governing these contracts and systems will be public, open, and properly decentralized. Because the minute you give a person a specific kind of authority over the network, you create centralization.
Mm. One last question on this. In terms of data storage, would any of that be off-chain, or the goal is to have it all on-chain?
No, the goal is to have actually basically almost all the critical data off-chain. We're trying to create a model where the principle is you will never put sensitive business information on chain. You will always put a representation or an off-chain link. You're only putting in as much information as required to make the logic or the process work, but all of your substantive information you really want to have off-chain, so that in the event that you're compromised or the chain is unraveled in some way, you could cut access to it and you'd have some control over your environment.
Simple. All right, let's kick it over to Washington and Kimlong.
All right. So this goes for the students out there, since we are all universities, right? So what is your advice for students who are looking to work in the Web3 industry?
So this is a great question. I love it. And I get asked it a lot of times. And I would say there's a couple of things that I really sort of urge people to do. First of all, you got to have good kind of core skills. And I've heard a lot of companies describe this as like a T-shaped skill structure. You need a bunch of skills in general, and then you need to be very, very good at one particular thing. So you can be a really good software developer, you could be a really good mathematician, you could be a really good supply chain expert, but you have to bring some particular exceptional skill to the table. That's one kind of critical thing. Second critical thing is you've got to bring sort of a willingness to, especially in a sort of a new area, you have to bring a willingness to sort of bootstrap your own skills and get yourself going, right? You have to be something of a self-starter, and you have to be you have to be sort of highly motivated. And this is honestly is really hard, but it's also essential. Many times in my career, I got told by clients like, Paul, you were not our first choice. In fact, you weren't even our second choice or our third choice. However, you were willing to get on a plane, you were willing to come over here, you were willing to stay the extra time and put in the extra hours and deal with some of the tough stuff. And I've worked honestly for really, really difficult clients. And in this day and age, it's not always popular to say this, but sometimes you can learn a lot of stuff from really demanding and difficult clients. And if you can stick it out and deal with the problems, then it's worthwhile. I'm a gay guy, and I spent I spent many years in places that are super gay, unfriendly. I've been invited by clients to strip clubs. I don't enjoy going. And I'll be honest with you, like as I've gotten more senior and gotten more power and visibility, my answer to, do you want to come out to dinner? Do you want to go drinking? Would you like to go to the club? Is no, because I never liked it, but I dealt with it. And it wasn't great, but it ended up clearing the path for me to do things from which I learned a great deal. And that's tough because it's not always fun. And I felt like at times, like honestly, it was at times like super depressing. I have a lot of sympathy for people who feel like they're in a hostile environment. Trust me, I've been there. My mother was a software developer in the 1960s. Like sexual harassment was like a daily activity. Right. We used to, as kids, we used to get like the download, like so-and-so told me he was dreaming about me today. Right. I'm like, okay. And it's tough, but it's not always useless. You can learn useful things from not great people in difficult situations. Right. Including learning useful things about yourself. The last thing, and I'm not recommending, I'm not saying it's fun or good or enjoyable, but I am saying that you can still learn a great deal from some of these folks and people and organizations. And then lastly, I really want to emphasize the value of like a broad-based liberal arts education. One of the things that we value a lot in America is, I'll call it like this meme-centric worldview, or this like, hey, that's a great argument. But a great argument isn't necessarily the same as a true argument. And cool ideas aren't necessarily valid. And I just want to share one little illustration with you. I was an econ major, and I was very fortunate to have as my economics professor a guy named Ben Bernanke, who later became the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And Professor Bernanke was kind of obsessed with the Great Depression. He was obsessed with the Great Depression and all the mistakes that America made in responding to the Great Depression, one of which involved not printing any money. And Ben Bernanke happened to be in charge of the Federal Reserve at the time of the Great Recession in 2008. And he opened the taps, right? Because he knew something, he knew a couple of really important things. Number one, printing money doesn't actually lead to inflation necessarily. And number two, deflationary systems are catastrophically bad. They are like nation-destroying bad. In fact, one of the most studied questions in economics is inflation bad? And the answer, it turns out, is unless it's like hyperinflation, like 60, 70, 80%, it turns out actually that economists have a hard time finding significant damage from inflation. Now, I'm not arguing that inflation, especially lots of it, is really good. But I would say the obsession, for example, that the cryptocurrency world has with limited supply and, you know, Bitcoin goes up forever, it's fundamentally wrong. It's been proven wrong over and over and over again in the world of economics. And that hasn't seemed to penetrate any of the mindset of people spewing out memes. And if you can have a good education that includes exposure to key ideas in economics and policy, statistics, how to tell the difference between a cool idea and just luck, right, is really important. So I want to make the case that to be effective, especially to grow your career beyond the early stages, you've got to be able to make good decisions. And you will make good decisions if you can do things like learn from history, tell the difference between a cool idea or a lucky win and a statistically significant outcome. These things are really important and eminently worthwhile in the longer term.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you kind of went the way of kind of the meme culture and how kind of people's opinions and kind of perceptions can get skewed. That kind of leads me to a question of, how do we onboard the next 100 million users, but how do we onboard them correctly? Because the blockchain Web3 space has certain kind of ethos around it that's very different than the traditional space. So how do we get this kind of hyper growth to get the next 100 million, but how do we make sure it's the 100 million that we want to see? Do you think it's going to come into play with institutions, or do you think it's going to still be more kind of retail, global driven?
It's going to be, if I'm being honest, it's going to be very institutionally driven. Web3 as it exists today is really hard to use, right? If you have ever bought like an NFT, right? Or better yet, if you've ever sort of talked somebody else through buying an NFT and you hear yourself and you're like, so first you need to go to a central exchange and you need to open up an account and then you need to send some money to the account. And they're like, I'm trying to do it. My Visa card says it's not allowed, right? And our bank has blocked wire transfer. And by the time you're done, you're like, I cannot believe how difficult this is. We have sort of, we've been in this water for so long, we've forgotten how terrible it is from a user experience perspective. And so institutions, they do a couple of things that are super helpful. Number one, they are really, really good at simplifying the user experience, right? Where they know how to make buying stocks and bonds and other types of digital assets seamless and easy and simple, right? One-click buying, basically. And we need that in the world of Web3. I do think there is a place for self-custody. There is a place for self-engagement by these users. And I think competition from institutions will actually prod the whole like Web3 user experience to get much better. Some user experiences are way better than others. I feel like some MetaMask, I've been hacked a couple times. Fortunately, always with like practice wallets that I keep for playing with stuff and doing risky transactions. But for example, I also have a smart contract wallet from Argent that has proven to be unhackable, right? It's really been incredibly resilient. On the other hand, it doesn't work so well in DeFi transactions. So I see pieces of the path forward, but I think the number one mechanism for bringing on the next generation of users is user interface, right? It's just got to be so much easier. And then I think the second thing is we've got to be clear about what is the value proposition. And, you know, ramming it down the throat of 30 million people in a country and telling them that Bitcoin will be good for them is not the way to do it, right? I think that's very clear. It doesn't work. I think showing that there's some value, whether it's protecting your wealth, giving you access to new investment options, allowing you to participate in DAOs and governance and collectibles, whatever it is, the community you want to engage in, there has to be a positive value combined with a simple user experience.
I do agree. As a child who grew up using a modem and the 56K type experience of just literal pixel line by pixel line, sometimes Web3 is very much the same kind of, it's not 3 days, but sometimes it's a little bit longer than you were expecting. So I'll throw back to Kimlong real quick because we got 2 back to back. If you had a follow up or anything, otherwise I can go ahead.
I don't have a follow up, but like I have other questions.
Yeah, go right ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me ask, Paul, are you a DeFi person?
I am a DeFi person. I'm a big fan of DeFi. I think it's absolutely transformational. I think in general, DeFi shows all the characteristics of the best parts of Web3, which is you've taken these building blocks, these sort of Lego building blocks, and we've made them standardized, stable coins, lending facilities, and we can stack them on top of each other, right? I don't need, the beauty of a permissionless, open, standardized architecture is I can take a stable coin from one provider and I can shove it into a lending protocol from another provider, right? We can start snapping these kind of business process components together. Now, DeFi is the first case example, and finance generally got started quickly because it's fully dematerialized. But eventually, I want to be able to do this kind of thing with, I want to take inventory, I want to take my inventory tokens and I want to plug them into a lending facility. I want to be able to have a accounts payable, like a receivables token, and I want to be able to borrow against it or get paid on it early, right? Ultimately, DeFi to me is just a prototype of what we will be able to do as we turn all kinds of business processes into these sort of reconfigurable Lego bricks. And then once we take them apart and standardize them, we can start snapping them back together in new ways.
Yeah,
I guess I've got a follow up. I've got a follow up for that is, in the sector, what is the future for DeFi? Is the regulation, it seems like it's going to be made via the courts these days. Is there anything else that you're aware of kind of to flesh that out so that it is fully decentralized and okay with, the powers that be?
So regulation by enforcement is always kind of suboptimal compared to, is often, not always, but often suboptimal compared to, say, regulation by actual specific positive rules. And one of the things that happens in sort of regulation by enforcement is in enforcement actions, there's one point of view that gets represented and decided upon, and it often doesn't get sort of debated or subject to public scrutiny. So you end up with sort of statements that maybe would not have been included if they had been subject to much more scrutiny, like saying everybody who voted on a DAO proposal is responsible for some kind of violation of the law, or that every transaction in a particular blockchain happens in a particular country because a lot of the nodes are in that country. These are not things that would necessarily feel sensible if they got a lot of public comment. So in general, I think regulation by enforcement is a bumpy road, and sometimes people settle in enforcement cases. They end up agreeing to a lot of things that they would normally not agree to just to make the settlement complete. They can't fight everything. You can't, if there's a huge power disparity, you can't redline the document and say, well, this is reasonable and that's not. So positive regulation would be great. There is absolutely clear signs in the US, in Europe, in the UK, in Japan, in Korea, that bills are working their ways through legislatures. They're being documented, rules are being formed. I guarantee you it's going to be a turbulent process and there'll be overreach and misapplication, but I am cautiously optimistic that we will, over a period of some years, end up with a reasonable and executable set of regulatory rules. One of the challenges with Web3 is we are doing some things in new ways that if you imply the rule incorrectly, or if you create a rule that's too complicated to implement, you could sort of accidentally kill the whole business segment, and that would not be a good outcome. I do think, for example, that one of the key principles that I've heard from the Bank of England, which I like and have repeated a lot, is it's a security. If it's a security, it's a security. And it's a security whether it's on the stock exchange or in the blockchain, right? It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter where it is. It matters what it is and what you do with it. And I think that's an excellent foundation. It doesn't change the fact that if blockchains work, and they do work in very different ways than stock exchanges, the rules may need to be tweaked or adjusted in order to have the same effective result.
Yeah, the Bank of England forgot to account for solidity. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, thinking about regulations correlation with adoption, and you were saying, you know, what's it going to take for the next million users to get into crypto? I was thinking, on the one hand, more regulation would be seen as a positive for those outside the crypto space, because you know, there's going to be less volatility and reasons along those lines. But then perhaps from the perspective of individuals already participating in DAOs, for example, regulation on the horizon could act as an incentive to, you know, get out the DAO if they think they're going to be held liable for decisions made in that DAO. So I don't know, I'm just interested to hear your opinion on both of those possible ebbs and flows in terms of regulation.
So early adopters in every technology are idealists. That's like a given. If you go back, you guys are all too young, but if you go back to the old days, you know, us old folks thought the internet was going to like make the world free. And, you know, we love this idea of this like borderless communication mechanism that was censorship resistant. Little did we know that it was entirely possible to build a firewall around an entire country, right? Well, honestly, like, there was a lot of disappointment about, to some degree, where the internet ended up compared to its overall promise, right? Especially around some of the more idealistic things like freedom of speech. And I actually wrote an editorial in CoinDesk once called "The Future of Ethereum Sucks and I Feel Fine." And it kind of boils down to this, same thing, which is, as an idealist, of the future of blockchain in many ways is going to be a little bit disappointing, right? This true open commercial ecosystem that's largely unconstrained by complex rules and is incredibly innovative is going to be tied down by rules. That's the nature of the game. But the good news is there's a couple pieces of good news. I think, first of all, every time we get a new technology, we have a new chance to either make the same mistakes or preferably like fix some of those and maybe make new ones, right? So I can be optimistic about that. And then secondly, we can't grow beyond a certain size. Blockchain is about as large as it can be today without regulation. With regulation, we can unlock torrents of institutional capital. If you think about the world's richest entities, and by the way, the world's richest entities, not individuals, pension funds, government investment funds, right? University endowments. These are the richest entities on earth. They're sitting on trillions of dollars, and they are legally obligated to only invest in sound investment-grade regulated assets. There's a couple $100 trillion of stocks and bonds and worth of assets that could be unlocked for use on the blockchain when regulation matures. So I think even idealists on the blockchain like me are like, wow, you know, we could have 200 times our current demand, right, if we're willing to accept the future of regulation. I think the incentives, the positives ultimately outweigh the loss of this like idealistic and exciting freedom, which, by the way, also was a playground for scam artists, con people, and liars, right? That was the real downside.
So the whole kind of notion of EY, you guys are a huge institution. So where do you guys kind of play your role? Because you mentioned the two applications you guys are building, one built, one being built. Are you guys kind of hopping in on the regulation front to kind of help shape policy, kind of put an axe like that into the world, or are you just more focused on kind of building and trying to grow the pie for everyone?
So my mission and the mission I'm trying to get to EY is I really fundamentally I want to change how the entire world does business. And in particular, I want to do two or three really important things. Number one, I believe that if we can apply blockchain to large enterprises, we can have two really big positive effects. We can make the world much more efficient, because transactions between companies are just about the most inefficient thing that large companies do. It's very slow, it's very cumbersome, there's a lot of friction there. So we can make the world much more efficient. Secondly, I believe that we can create a much more fair and equal set of outcomes in the world of digital commerce. We live in an era, in the Web 2.0 era, of digital monopolies. And digital monopolies exist because network effects of commerce are so powerful. On the blockchain, we can have digital commerce without creating digital monopolies, right? And I think in those environments, more of the value that gets created by companies goes back to the enterprise, especially the small business, and that in turn gets shared out to employees and shareholders. So we can make the world bigger, richer, and fairer using blockchain technology. That being said, to get there, I think there's two or three things that we've really got to do. Number one, we have to convince the world's big businesses that blockchain technology and cryptocurrency are not scary, they're not dangerous, they're not risky. You can do business legally and safely. And so one of the first steps is, if a Big Four audit firm comes and tells you that, yes, you will not go to jail if you accept a Bitcoin or you use Ether or you participate in DeFi, like that's the first thing, right? You're going to ask your auditors, can we do this? And when your auditors say, yes, you can, it's a lot less scary, right? As I always like to joke, our auditors would not do well in prison, okay? Like, they're not going to give you advice that's going to land them in prison. Secondly, we need to lead the way in showing enterprises how to use this technology in their business. So we are building blockchain applications. We have ops chain, we have smart contract testing, we have audit tools. So we are building applications that use this technology. And then thirdly, we are trying to address what we think are a particular shortcoming. And if you ask people about blockchain, they'll tell you, the first thing they always tell you is like, oh, it doesn't scale. But as I've often told Vitalik and just about anybody else who listens to me, there will never be a true scalability problem if we don't solve the privacy problem. Like, we will get to a certain size and we won't be able to go larger because people won't be comfortable without privacy. So I feel like everybody on Earth has been addressing the scalability problem. That's been the hottest topic, and everyone's always thinking about that. But for 6 years, I feel like sometimes often in total obscurity, we've been hammering away at the privacy problem. And I think ultimately, when I think about sort of my legacy and EY's legacy in this business, it will be to have convinced large enterprises that it is safe, shown the way with some use cases, and helped build out this privacy technology.
Awesome.
And yes, on top of that, we do engage with the regulators. We don't do so quite so publicly because we're trying to be respectful of the regulators, right? We don't want to be one of those like pushy entities that's telling people like, have an editorial, this is terrible, you're stupid or something. Like, that's not constructive engagement. But we do behind the scenes talk to almost every central bank and major regulator in the world.
Awesome. And then one thing that I am curious about, so as you kind of mentioned, you guys have been building away for 6 years. So what kind of decisions, or how do you guys process what blockchain to build on? Do you think the future is multi-chain? How big of a role do you think interoperability is going to play within the next 10, 15 years?
So I personally am a big interoperability skeptic. And this is where I always argue that it's time to study history, right? The reality is that in technology ecosystems, we tend to end up with technology monopolies. There aren't 20 different kinds of internet. There's one kind of internet. And by the way, the internet is terrible. Like, we're doing a video conference on the internet. The internet was not made for video conferencing. It wasn't even made for audio. Like, if you were to ask an engineer in charge of TCP IP like 40 years ago, like, hey, what do you think if we did real-time audio and video? He'd be like, are you crazy? Like, that is nuts. There's no quality of service. We don't know, what happens is the largest network and the most flexible network becomes the most successful network. And it becomes that even though the network itself is deeply suboptimal. There are so many better ways for us to handle voice and video and data separately, or to mix them together. There were very, very cool ideas like frame relay, ATM, asynchronous transfer mode, like a really cool technology that was around about 30 years ago. None of them succeeded. They all had some influence over kind of TCP IP and the evolution of the internet, but they didn't succeed. And that's how it's going to be with all these other blockchains. Ethereum has won, in my opinion. It's game over. And being very, very constrained in my engineering budget and being kind of a strategy guy, I have a kind of a simple approach. I want to be, and I want EY to be, the very best on earth at Ethereum. Not because Ethereum is the best blockchain. I'm sure it isn't. And I never get into discussions about what's better or worse. I wanted us to be the best at Ethereum because, and we only really build on Ethereum for the simple reason that Ethereum is the biggest blockchain, right? And if you look at the history of business, the rewards for being number one in the biggest market are many times larger than the rewards from being pretty good at half a dozen different things. So I say with sincere gratitude to all of my competitors who are still pitching private blockchains and telling people they're technology agnostic, thank you so much. Please keep doing that.
Interesting. So I know, like my kind of personal view is Ethereum obviously is one of the biggest blockchains, and it's an amazing kind of piece of technology. But I see more of the EVM, Ethereum Virtual Machine, living on. To me, that kind of technological advancement is what is kind of rooted in history as the go-to smart contracts machine. So how do you see kind of the future of the EVM living on, or just kind of total ETH domination?
So it's ETH domination, but you have to remember that ETH domination is not sort of quite as monolithic as you think, right? One of the things that is great about Ethereum is the Ethereum Foundation is absorbing good ideas all the time, right? They do so in a very careful and in some ways like dissatisfyingly slow way compared to the competition, but they do, there's going to be sharding. There was a transition to proof of stake. There's intense competition and lots of innovation going on in layer 2. So I think Ethereum and the EVM will become this ecosystem, and the competitive battleground isn't like alternate layer 1s, it's layer 2s and interoperability across layer 2s. So the competition and innovation in the ecosystem isn't going away, but I do think it is shifting to a layer 2 system. All the ETH killers are dead.
Interesting. I know, Miguel, you have a question on kind of ETH merge, so I won't steal your thunder if you want to ask that one.
Oh, well, I was just going to say about the merge. If you're really just concerned with actually fundamentally building on the blockchain, then does the merge really have a big impact? It might have an impact on the longevity, on the life of the blockchain, but that's different than actually here and now and building on the ground, right?
Well, yes and no. So the merge had like it really, in the short run, it had like zero impact. Like we 36 hours after the merge, we confirmed that all of our applications are running exactly as designed. Our nodes have synced, everything's fine. The merge had two important kind of impacts. So first of all, from a perception impact, for a long time, we've known for several years that Ethereum is the winner. But I think it's taken the merge to drive home to all the other enterprises in this space that yes, Ethereum is the winner. The institutional team can handle big, transitions of, what is today a multi-$100 billion piece of financial and operational infrastructure. So the Ethereum Foundation and the Ethereum ecosystem proved it can handle big, important stuff without screwing it up. And that is super important. That is the level of conservative, careful behavior that if you're a large enterprise, you're looking for in essential infrastructure. And that was a really good signal. More importantly, I think the merge clears the path for other stuff like sharding and higher levels of scalability and stateless machines. And these are important because of what's coming. today, and I give you a really good example. So one of the use cases that we want to unlock with privacy is supply chain management. And supply chain management means not just having a single token that gives you data about, say, an entire batch of beer or a history of a case of wine. A single token can be attached to a single product or a single package of medicine that's serialized. Now, we have one client who, for one product, mints 500,000 NFTs a day, right? Each NFT moves 4 times. That means that in the course of a week, their average rate of transactions, if they fully move this asset on chain, would be 2 million transactions a day per product, and they have hundreds of products, right? When we sit down and we look at sort of what we think we need volume-wise to truly bring enterprise supply chains online, we think about numbers in the range of 4 to 6 billion transactions a day worth of capacity. That's what we think is necessary or will get unlocked and used by enterprises. So at 4 to 6 billion transactions a day, right, we need layer 2s. We're probably going to need layer 3s. You know, the merge opens up this path to sharding, many layer 2 applications. We are going to need, we are not using any of that capacity now, but I believe we are going to need it.
I do agree. Yeah, the future, especially if it is the one, right, which there's never been a blockchain like Ethereum before, you're going to need the throughput. So we will throw it back to Kimlong in Washington if there's any burning desires here, maybe for one last question here before Mr. Brody's time's up.
All right, yeah, I want to discuss something similar actually. So with the adoption of new scaling technologies such as ROBs and data availability solutions, many smart contracts are actually not fully utilized. So due to the increased throughput, we agree that industries should start to focus on creating novel applications instead of as their main goal.
So novel applications as the main goal, I don't think is the point. What you're seeing here is like a classic enterprise and technology evolution cycle where one part of the ecosystem takes a step forward and then has a lot of capacity, and then other parts of the ecosystem don't really know how to use that, right? Or other parts of the ecosystem, they mature to a level where they're taxing it. So we've gone through phases where we had too many transactions and not enough capacity. Now we're in a phase where we have lots of capacity, but not enough transactions, and the volume of potential capacity is rising. As I said before, with an expectation on the horizon of 4 to 6 billion transactions a day being necessary for industrial applications, I have no concerns that we will use up all this capacity that we're creating and then some. But the thing that I often caution people about is, is just because you're using a lot of capacity doesn't mean, for example, that ETH or some other gas fee commodity is going to become really valuable, right? Market prices are often set by this blend of supply and demand, and it's possible that ETH could be wildly successful. It is wildly successful. It could dominate the entire commercial ecosystem. That does not guarantee that gas prices will go up to some astronomical level fueled by a really high level of ETH prices, simply because as prices go up, people do with ETH transactions the same thing that they do with cars. They figure out how to use less gas and go further. So for sure, this thing being out of balance is something that's going to happen periodically. I bet you a few years from now, we're going to run smack into another round of constraints and have to think about them again. And they might not be transaction volume. It might be off-chain data storage or some other mechanism. But that's kind of the cycle, right? You hit a certain level, right? You use up a bunch of capacity. People spend a lot of time thinking about it. They fix the problem, and then suddenly, for a while, it looks like we'll never need all that capacity, and somebody will figure out how to use it productively, and it'll get all used up. You are right, though, that I think kind of this cycle of use cases never ends, right? It's true in PCs, it's true on the internet, it's true with smartphones. Every period of time, people are always coming up with some new use case for these tools.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Brody. And for anybody tuning in, as well as, you know, our panelists as well, what can, just as a final wrap up here, what can they do just quickly to kind of get started quickly in the industry if they're really, I have no idea, but hey, I'm a programmer or an engineer or something. What's your 60-second, this is how you get started?
You know, the best way to start is to learn by doing. One of the blog entries that blew me away a couple of years ago was, I think it's the founder of Signal. He's like, oh, I want to learn about Web3. And so he decided to go and like make himself a set of NFTs. And he wrote up this amazing blog entry about how he went from not knowing really anything about Web3 to making some NFTs, and all of his observations along the way as an experienced software developer and kind of privacy expert. It was brilliant. It was super impressive. That's how I learned. I learned by doing. So pick a small project. I once picked as a small project, I wanted to clean up my address book. And I used it as a way to learn some programming skills. And at the end of the weekend, my address book was an absolute disaster, right? Every single address was garbled. And I knew a great deal more about software development on the Mac than I probably really needed to know. And I was sleep deprived and had to go to work on Monday morning. But it was a great learning experience. I learned by doing. I think many other people do as well. Pick some small project, the equivalent of Hello World for Web3, and then go do it.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, as well as Mr. Paul Brody for joining us once again, the global blockchain leader out there, Ernst & Young. Thanks, y'all. See you soon.
Thank you.